The chronicles speak of discovery, of brave Portuguese sailors crossing the Atlantic to claim Brazil for crown and cross in the year 1500. But chronicles lie with the practiced ease of courtiers, and the truth they conceal is far more disturbing than any fiction they might invent. What truly transpired when those salt-crusted, fever-weakened men first glimpsed the emerald coastline was not discovery, it was dissolution. The dissolution of everything they believed themselves to be, everything they thought they understood about the nature of desire, about the boundaries of the human heart, about the very meaning of civilization itself. These were not the heroic figures of popular imagination. After months at sea, they had become something else entirely, walking scarecrows of European pretension, their bodies ravaged by scurvy and dysentery, their minds hollowed out by isolation and the constant proximity of death. They stank of unwashed flesh and rotting teeth, of desperation and the peculiar madness that comes from staring too long at an endless horizon. When they finally stumbled onto Brazilian shores, they were already more ghost than man, more hunger than human being. And then they encountered them. Not individuals at first, but the very concept of otherness made flesh. Indigenous women who moved through their world with a grace that European eyes had never witnessed, who wore their nakedness like nobility, who possessed a confidence that no European woman, swathed in layers of shame and fabric, could ever approximate. In that moment of first contact, something fundamental cracked in the architecture of European souls. If you're already questioning everything you thought you knew about colonial history, then you understand why this story has been buried for centuries. But what I'm about to reveal will shatter even your revised expectations of human nature and European civilization. Before we continue this journey into the darkest corners of colonial truth, take a moment to like this video, because what you're about to discover will challenge every comfortable assumption about desire, power, and the human capacity for transformation. And if you're brave enough to confront these disturbing realities, subscribe, because there are countless more hidden truths waiting to be unearthed from the archives of human shame. The crossing had already begun their metamorphosis. 6 months of wooden imprisonment had stripped away the veneer of European sophistication, revealing the raw animal beneath. These men had lived in their own filth, shared the same stagnant air, felt their bodies waste away until they resembled walking cadavers more than the proud representatives of Catholic civilization they had imagined themselves to be. They had watched companions die of diseases whose names they did not know, had thrown friends into the Atlantic depths while mumbling prayers to a god who seemed to have abandoned them somewhere between Lisbon and the endless blue void. But it was not the physical degradation that would prove most significant. It was the psychological dissolution that had already begun. Months of maritime isolation had eroded the social boundaries that had once defined them. The strict hierarchies of European society had collapsed under the weight of shared misery. Nobles had begged commoners for water. Priests had forgotten their prayers. The careful distinctions between the civilized and the savage had blurred until they no longer seemed to matter. When they finally reached Brazilian shores, what stumbled onto that pristine sand was not an invasion force, but a collection of broken men whose grip on their own identity had already loosened beyond repair. And in their weakened state, they encountered something that would complete their transformation, a society that operated according to entirely different principles, where the human body was not a source of shame but of celebration, where sexuality was not hidden beneath layers of Catholic guilt, but integrated into the very fabric of social life. The indigenous women they encountered moved with a fluid sensuality that European eyes could barely comprehend. These women had never learned to be ashamed of their bodies, had never been taught that desire was sinful or that pleasure was forbidden. They decorated their skin with intricate patterns that told stories of ancestry and belonging, that transformed their bodies into living artworks celebrating the connection between human and divine, between individual and cosmos. For European men who had spent their entire lives believing that the female form was either sacred or profane, never simply natural, this encounter proved psychologically catastrophic. Here were women who swam naked in rivers without the slightest self-consciousness, who participated in ceremonies where bodies moved in rhythms that spoke of ancient connections to earth and sky, who treated sexuality as a natural expression of human vitality rather than a dangerous force that required constant suppression. The Portuguese sailors' response revealed the profound poverty of European sexuality. Men who had crossed an ocean believing themselves the representatives of a superior civilization discovered that they knew nothing about the most fundamental aspects of human experience. Their own sexual lives had been constrained by fear, shaped by guilt, hemmed in by religious prohibitions that treated natural desire as evidence of spiritual corruption. But here, in this new world, they encountered sexual practices that challenged every assumption they held about human nature. Indigenous ceremonies incorporated nudity and sensual movement as expressions of spiritual connection. courtship rituals celebrated physical beauty and emotional compatibility in ways that European customs, constrained by economic considerations and family alliances, could never accommodate. Sexual relationships were understood as partnerships between equals rather than transactions between property owners. The sailors' response to these revelations was immediate and disturbing. Men who had been barely surviving on ship's rations suddenly found themselves confronted with women whose very existence seemed to mock everything they had been taught about femininity, sexuality, and the proper relationship between desire and civilization. Their reaction was not admiration or respect. It was a desperate attempt to impose their own broken understanding of sexuality onto a culture that had never needed their definitions. The violence began almost immediately, but it was not the straightforward brutality of military conquest. It was something far more insidious, the violence of men who could not bear to witness sexuality that existed outside their control, who could not tolerate the sight of women who had never learned to be ashamed of their own bodies. They began to develop practices that combined their own sexual deprivation with their need to dominate and control what they could not understand. These men, who had spent months in enforced celibacy, who had been taught that sexual desire was evidence of spiritual weakness, suddenly found themselves in a world where sexuality was integrated into daily life in ways that their European minds could not process. Their response was to create hybrid practices that satisfied their own twisted needs, while attempting to destroy the indigenous understanding of sexuality that so threatened their worldview. They developed rituals of sexual domination that served multiple purposes, satisfying their physical needs while simultaneously destroying the cultural frameworks that had made indigenous sexuality so threatening to their European sensibilities. They forced indigenous women to participate in European sexual practices that treated the female body as an object of shame and conquest rather than celebration and partnership. But perhaps most disturbing was their attempt to combine European sexual practices with indigenous rituals, creating hybrid ceremonies that perverted both traditions. They would force indigenous women to participate in bastardized versions of indigenous ceremonies while imposing European concepts of sexual submission and shame. These practices satisfied neither the physical needs that had driven the sailors to desperation, nor the spiritual connections that had made indigenous sexuality so powerful. The documentation of these practices exists in letters, journals, and official reports that colonial authorities tried to suppress or destroy. The evidence reveals men who had been psychologically shattered by their maritime ordeal, who encountered a sexuality that challenged everything they believed about human nature, and who responded with practices that combined desperate need with vindictive destruction. Pause for a moment and consider what you've just learned. This single revelation, that European sexual practices in colonial Brazil were not expressions of natural desire but desperate attempts to destroy what Europeans could not understand or control, changes everything, doesn't it? It makes you wonder what other lies have been carefully constructed around the events we call sexual liberation or cultural exchange. If this story is affecting you the way it's affecting me, if you're feeling that uncomfortable shift in your understanding of colonial sexuality, then leave a comment below. Tell me, what other historical truths about sexuality and conquest are you now questioning? Because your insights matter, and they help me understand which buried stories need to be told next. And if you're ready to go even deeper into these forbidden histories of desire and domination, make sure you're subscribed with notifications on, because what's coming next will make this revelation seem tame by comparison. The transformation of these European sailors was complete within months of their arrival. Men who had once considered themselves representatives of Christian civilization had become something else entirely, hybrid creatures whose sexuality combined European shame with indigenous ritual in ways that satisfied neither tradition. They had not conquered the sexuality they encountered. They had been conquered by it, transformed into something that could exist in neither world. Their sexual practices became increasingly elaborate and disturbing as they attempted to reconcile their European understanding of sexuality as domination with their desperate need for the integration and connection they witnessed in indigenous cultures. They created ceremonies that incorporated elements of Catholic ritual with perverted versions of indigenous practices, producing hybrid sexual rituals that served neither spiritual connection nor physical satisfaction, but only the psychological need to control what they could not understand. The indigenous community's response to these practices reveals their own understanding of what was happening. They recognized that these European men were not healthy expressions of human sexuality, but symptoms of a profound psychological and spiritual sickness. The indigenous understanding of sexuality as integration and connection made it impossible for them to comprehend European sexuality as conquest and domination. Some indigenous women attempted to heal what they perceived as European sexual sickness by introducing the sailors to authentic indigenous practices of sexual connection and spiritual integration. But these attempts at healing were consistently corrupted by European inability to separate sexuality from power, pleasure from domination, connection from conquest. The long-term consequences of these sexual encounters shaped colonial Brazilian society in ways that persist to this day. The hybrid sexual practices developed by European sailors became institutionalized in colonial culture, creating patterns of sexual domination and cultural destruction that would define colonial relationships for centuries. These practices also fundamentally altered European understanding of sexuality. Sailors who returned to Europe carried with them experiences that challenged European sexual norms, but rather than integrating these experiences in healthy ways, they simply added layers of colonial domination to existing European patterns of sexual shame and control. The documentation of these sexual practices provides insight into the profound psychological damage that colonialism inflicted not only on colonized peoples, but on the colonizers themselves. European sailors who encountered indigenous sexuality were psychologically unprepared for cultures that had integrated sexuality into spiritual and social life in healthy ways. Their response, the development of sexual practices that combined European shame with indigenous ritual in destructive hybrid forms, reveals the extent of European psychological and spiritual poverty. The most disturbing aspect of these practices was their deliberate attempt to destroy indigenous understanding of sexuality while satisfying European sexual needs. These were not expressions of natural desire, but calculated attempts to corrupt indigenous spiritual practices while dominating indigenous women. They represent European inability to learn from cultures that had developed healthier relationships between sexuality, spirituality, and social organization. The legacy of these practices extends far beyond the immediate colonial period. The hybrid sexual culture that developed in colonial Brazil, combining European domination with corrupted versions of indigenous practices, became embedded in Brazilian social structures in ways that continue to influence contemporary culture. Modern Brazilian sexuality still bears the marks of this colonial trauma, this fundamental corruption of indigenous understanding of healthy sexual integration. Understanding these historical realities requires confronting uncomfortable truths about European colonialism and its long-term psychological and cultural consequences. The sexual practices developed by European sailors in colonial Brazil were not aberrations or individual pathologies, but systematic attempts to destroy indigenous culture while satisfying European needs. They represent the sexual dimension of colonial violence, the way that conquest extended into the most intimate aspects of human experience. This, then, is the true legacy of European colonialism in Brazil, not the triumph of civilization over wilderness, but the revelation that European civilization was itself a form of psychological and spiritual wilderness, a collection of practices and beliefs that prevented healthy human development and integration. The sexual practices of European sailors in colonial Brazil were not expressions of superior European culture, but symptoms of profound European dysfunction, attempts to impose psychological sickness onto cultures that had achieved healthier forms of human integration. You came here thinking you knew the story of European colonization and sexual practices in Brazil. You're leaving with the uncomfortable knowledge that everything you were taught was a carefully constructed fiction designed to hide the profound dysfunction of European sexuality and its violent imposition on healthier indigenous cultures. That transformation you've just experienced, that dissolution of comfortable certainties about European sexual liberation and indigenous sexual primitivity, is exactly what those Portuguese sailors felt when they encountered Brazilian indigenous communities 500 years ago, except that they responded with violence and domination rather than learning and growth. The question now is, what will you do with this knowledge? Will you let it dissolve back into the comfortable amnesia of everyday assumptions about sexuality and colonialism? Or will you seek out more of these buried truths about the real history of human sexual development? If you choose the path of uncomfortable knowledge about sexuality and power, then like this video to signal that you're ready for more revelations about the hidden history of human desire and domination. Subscribe to join a community of people who refuse to accept sanitized versions of sexual history and colonial relationships. And in the comments, share your thoughts on this story, because every person who engages with these hidden truths about sexuality and colonialism helps ensure they can never be buried again under comfortable lies about European sexual superiority and indigenous sexual primitivity. The chronicles may lie about conquest and civilization, but together we can make sure the truth about sexuality, power, and colonial violence survives.